How's everybody today? Doha and Amina, are you there?
Oh, so sorry. I was on mute. Hi, good morning.
Good morning. How are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm well, thank you.
Good.
Doha,
I,
how are you? What were you gonna say, Amina?
I was gonna say I love your hair.
Oh, thank you. All of my little hairstyles I've been doing myself. So,
Yeah. Yeah, me too.
yeah, got to be creative or rely on your resources, I should say.
Hey, good morning.
Good morning, Dr. Alexander. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you.
Good. So, I guess we can wait just a minute or two and let a few more students come in, and then we can get started. So while we're waiting, those of you who are present, the film for quiz 2, American Circumcision, what did you think? Nobody has comments? Mm. Okay. Dr. Alexander, you can start at exactly 12:05.
Okay. How are you doing this morning?
I'm really, really well.
Or it's afternoon now. So
Yeah, no, I'm really good.
good.
How about you?
I'm doing okay. I Monday, and it's supposed to be my week off, and
Oh,
I can never take time off though, because they always call me for something. So
oh, it's not just us, huh?
no, I had planned this, but the other stuff comes up. We're dealing with student protests right now. So there's a list of demands and there's some reactions going back and forth. And they called a meeting this morning at noon. I said, well, I can't be there at noon. It's kind of a pre-meeting to another meeting that's supposed to happen in a couple of days. And so we're having a town hall meeting with our Black students and some of our Black faculty and staff. So we'll see how that goes. They'll clue me in later. I just told them I couldn't make it. So
It is a tense time.
yeah, it is. It really is.
And so much is going on during an election year.
Yeah.
The momentum that has been created over the last couple of months is not going to stop for a while.
No, I don't think so. I think it's a new beginning in some ways.
And we as professionals have to figure out a way of ushering it in with grace.
Exactly.
It doesn't deserve to be made more difficult or complex. Okay, so we are on.
Okay. So I don't know how you generally do Zoom meetings, but I know there's 7 of us on all together. I see 2 live faces and I see blank screens on the others. And, you know, what I'd like for you all to do, if you don't mind, is to, you know, show yourselves so that I know you're present. You can always go back to the blank screen, but just out of courtesy and respect, if you don't mind. And that way I know that, hey, how you doing, Pedro? I know that you're with me and you're tuned in. So I don't know if Doha or Isabella, if you're, Amina, if you're available to do that. Jim, I appreciate you.
Okay, I'll put it in the chat as well.
So, but anyways, I just do that with my classes because I've just finished teaching a course that ended this past, not too long ago, actually. It just seems like the month is flying by. We're headed into July. But I just, for 10 weeks, you know, we've been on Zoom and we talked and we discussed and we shared. And like I said, I always make sure my students just check in visually so I know that they're present. And then it's up to them if they want to stay visually tuned in or not. But like I said, it's just a check-in. So anyways, how's everybody doing? First of all, you can raise your hand if you're doing well, and if you're on visual. If you're not, maybe you could chat and just let me know that you're doing fine. I see that, you know, given who we have on today, we'll have a conversation, okay? Mine is more a conversation and a discussion versus trying to give you a lecture. I mean, I can give you a lecture as well. And there's some things I'll be sharing with you that I'd like to have your reaction to. And given that, again, we're a smaller group, I was thinking possibly going into breakouts, but we may not have to do that if we continue with the group that we have. I don't know if you can make me a co-host so I can share slides, Professor Orvis.
Yes, give me just one moment.
Okay, I'll keep talking though. I'm not going to pop them up right now. But I just wanted to thank you all for giving me the opportunity to come into your worlds, your Zoom world, and to share with you some information about the African American family. And I'll give you a little bit of background on myself and then some perspectives that I'm going to share with you about the family. And then we'll have some discussion and I'll share some information with you that hopefully will elicit some discussion from you all. First of all, you know, I have a couple roles at UCLA. I'm a professor in public health and community dentistry, even though I don't practice dentistry. It's just when I moved here from the Bay Area, I used to live in Oakland and worked for UCSF before coming to Los Angeles. And my role there was an associate dean. I was a dean in the School of Dentistry doing admissions and student affairs work. But my background is in sociology. So my degrees are all in sociology. I have a bachelor's, master's, and a PhD in sociology. But my interest is in public health and what they would call the sociology of medicine, because I was always interested in how health and communities intersect in the sense that, you know, we need more healthcare providers from, you know, Black and brown communities to be present, to be able to connect culturally as well as linguistically with our communities, and also because of the fact that when you're in those kind of roles, you tend to take on a leadership responsibilities, and as leaders, we should be advocating for our own health and our own well-beings. And so that's how I got involved in the health aspect, working for medical and dental schools for the last who knows how many years. But my whole purpose in life is really to do two things. One is to increase the diversity of healthcare providers from Black and Brown communities, um, because of the shortage that exists. And number two is to also raise awareness and train non-Black and Brown healthcare providers about the cultural attributes and the need to be culturally sensitive, or what they call culturally humble or culturally competent, to provide care to communities in which African American and Latino, Latinx people reside. So in other words, if we can't, and it's probably not gonna happen in my lifetime, if we can't get parity with, you know, Black physicians and brown physicians and nurses and dentists and so on, then we need to train those who are going to be treating our people. And we need to make them aware of the differences that exist from a cultural standpoint, because we all have cultural histories and backgrounds that are not commonly taught in these health profession schools. And the course I teach actually is called Ethnic and Racial Disparities in Healthcare. And it's all about trying to train future healthcare providers on how to be culturally sensitive and aware of the differences that exist in our respective communities. And I'll talk a little bit about that later, because I think it kind of ties into the family quite a bit, because if you don't know, you know, families are pretty much involved in making healthcare decisions. I mean, when we make healthcare decisions, very, very seldom do we make them by ourselves. We tend to fall on family members or call on family members. Or in some cases, you know, if it's not the matriarch, it's the patriarch member of the family that we call on, just to get their opinion, their view, and their perspective on how we should proceed with whatever kind of care that's being offered to us. There are some people, though, that don't rely on that, you know, and for the most part, they make decisions independently on their own and say they're going to do that. And generally that happens with people who are not from cultural backgrounds. It's just a way of life, the way they do things. But, you know, we're more communal people, we're more family orientated, and we rely on the community and the network that supports us to help us make these kind of decisions in life. So anyways, I wanted to share that with you to kind of get us started in terms of my background. My other aspect of the background is that, you know, I'm an academic and an administrator. So my whole purpose is really to not only train and to help undergraduates and graduate students get through UCLA, but also to provide some guidance and some direction on a career that they might be interested in. And being an academic means that my only job has been with universities. So I haven't been a corporate guy. You know, I haven't worked that much in the nonprofit sector, even though I was on boards for nonprofits. But my whole life has been devoted to higher education and preparing people to move on to higher levels of education, whether it's professional school or graduate school. And so, so I'm really honored and I'm really humbled to be with you all today to talk a little bit about my experiences and some of the things that I've experienced, including teaching a course called The Black Family years ago. As a sociologist, you know, we get sometimes chosen by our departments to choose, to pick courses to choose, right, Dr. Horowitz, Professor Horowitz? And then some we can choose on our own. So, you know, the rotation to teach introduction to sociology always went around. And that was, of course, that many people didn't want to teach because they were large classes and you didn't have a lot of discussion. And so, but at some point you had to teach it because it was a rotation through the department. But then there were courses that you were very fond of and you specialized in and you wanted to do. So mine was always, you know, the African American family or ethnic and racial relations or healthcare disparities, you know, and then sometimes I taught courses on deviant behavior or corrections or criminology. But the ones that I really enjoyed the most are the ones that, like I said, I have a passion for, and that's the health aspect of it. And then, of course, those that deal with communities and family. So anyways, that's sort of a short background introduction that I wanted to give you. Let me see now if I can pull up some slides so we can start talking a little bit more. Because you all can see the slides, I take it?
Yes.
Okay, good. So I gave you a little introduction to myself, so you pretty much get a sense to see who I am. And then the plan for today is really to talk a brief history in scholarship on the Black family. As I mentioned earlier, talk a little bit about disparities in healthcare and how they relate to family. And then the last thing I want to talk about is genealogy, because I think it's important for us to understand our beginnings and who we are and where we're from and who we're all about. So just a brief history. I'm not going to go into a great detail. There's some really wonderful books out there that you can get some history, you know, about African American families. I mean, even before emancipation. And I threw this one up because emancipation, when it occurred, enslaved people were really trying to find their family members. I mean, they were freed overnight, and then of course, you know, the next thing they wanted to do is try to connect up with people that had been missing from their families. So between 1880 and 1960, two-parent families were widespread among Black people. I mean, it was just common, and part of that was from tradition in terms of what was carried over from the African countries that they were captured and enslaved and brought to America, but also even within the plantation. I mean, there was family ties, and you know, the whole notion of two-parent families being married and so forth was pretty common. But after 1960, single-parent families began to increase, and we'll talk about that because you know you probably wondering, you know, what was going on, you know, after 1960 that led to the so-called demise of the Black family. And I think this is important to understand too, in terms of treatment of Black families in social science scholarship, because as I mentioned, when I was teaching this course, I always struggled to try to find research or articles or information on the Black family that would help me with my course. And one of the things that I did learn is that, you know, the information on Black families was very, very hard to find. In fact, there's a really seminal book by Andrew Billingsley called Black Families in America, in which he really speaks to that issue, because Black family scholarship was really the work, depending on the work of white sociologists back in the day. And the white sociologists, as you can see, these 4 points I pointed out, either they ignored the Black family in terms of their social science, maybe they didn't find it to be important, or they focus almost exclusively on low-income groups within the Black family or within the Black community. They did ignore the majority of Black stable families, even among the lowest income groups. They didn't do a lot of research on that group. I mean, there's books like, I mean, I can go on like, you know, and most of the sociologists would they were more what I call participant observers. They didn't actually do surveys and studies. They just went and they lived and they observed and they watched communities, and then they made research conclusions based upon that. Or, you know, they view the Black, low-income, unstable, problem-ridden family as a cause for the difficulties that the members in the experience in the wider society. In other words, they blame the family or the person within the family as a problem to the Black family being so-called unstable. And so as you can imagine, you know, this going on, I mean, this is like early social science research. And it was pretty limited, like I said, to white social scientists, because there weren't a lot of Black sociologists at the time studying the family back in the day. And over the years, you know, from that seminal book from Billingsley, the study of the Black family by other Black sociologists began to take off. Now, I will mention there was a Black sociologist back in the early 1900s named E. Franklin Frazier. And I think if you're interested in sociology, he was probably one of the first Black sociologists that studied the family. And he looked at family patterns back in the day. And in fact, Billingsley kind of builds off some of his work, because Frazier was a pretty well-known Black sociologist at the time and pretty well respected. So a lot of his work early on in terms of the family was published. But if you can think about, you know, what was going on in the 1960s, and I know some of you probably weren't around at the time, but if you're a fan of history, you know, the 1960s, you know, became really the fertile ground and the beginning of what we call maybe the modern day civil rights movement, in the sense that people began to move from rural areas to cities. People began to recognize that racism and discrimination was rampant and widespread, and, you know, groups began to form to speak out against these injustices. And so there was also a lot of employment in terms of manufacturing going on. So some people were moving from the South to the North to take on new jobs, and, you know, either calling their family up once they got stabled, or in some cases, maybe not calling the family at all. But the 60s, you know, became really a crucial point for the Black family. And one of the things that I want to point out that happened in the 60s was a report by, well, he was a senator at one time, Daniel Patrick Moynihan. And the Moynihan report was very pivotal back in the day. And it concluded that the structure of family life in the Black community, he called it a tangle of pathology. It was capable of perpetuating itself without assistance from the world. And that at the heart of the deterioration of the fabric of Negro society, he called, is a deterioration of the Negro family. So he, again, stated it is the fundamental source of the weakness of the Negro community at this present time. So in other words, Moynihan actually looked at labor statistics to come up with this report. And he looked at, you know, in terms of unemployment, who's being employed in what kind of occupations and positions, what the differences in terms of unemployment rates of Blacks and whites and other groups. And he concluded in his report that, you know, the family being, you know, the structural unit was the main factor in the Black community dealing with the issues of the time. Which later on, you know, Billingsley kind of pointed out is not weakness in the family structure, but it was really poverty, racism, which is really the true tango pathology that afflicts Black people. So it wasn't a family, and we'll talk a little bit about this in a moment. It was really what was going on at the time. There was high rates of poverty. There was definitely a lot of racism going on, you know, and as a result, you know, people couldn't get jobs. They couldn't live in certain neighborhoods. They couldn't get interviews. Education was limited, segregated. And so the racism kind of coupled with poverty led to this family structure, a so-called weakness in the family structure. But it wasn't really a weakness. It was really the structures that were operating in that prevented these families from thriving. And in the end, you know, Billingsley would say the family is really a creature of society. So when you think about society back then, what was going on? Society was preventing these families from really flourishing. And not only that, but Moynihan was looking at the family from the lens of a white person, you know, white families, you know, mother, father, daughter, son, dog, cat, you know. He was really looking at it from that perspective. And if you know the history of families, they, particularly in African-American family structure, it wasn't typical white Caucasian family styles that we adopted. In fact, you know, as time went on and Billingsley did his research, he looked at three basically kind of families that we tend to evolve from. And this was really as a result of the migration of Black people from, you know, south to the north, and also even further back, how slaves were required or forced to live. So he came up with extended families, for example. Extended families are families in which it might be the mother, father, brother, sister, grandmother, grandfather. You know, it could be, that was the household. In fact, when I was growing up, I and my family resided in an extended family at a time, where it was me, my mother, my grandmother, my grandfather, and you know, other members of the family. Billingsley also talked about augmented families, and these were families where you would have maybe your mother, father, grandmother, maybe your uncle and your aunt and your cousins. Okay, and again, another version of the extended family. And if you think about slavery at the time and where slaves lived, they lived in slave quarters. They had their own households. They had their own family structures. You know, they had their children and their husbands and wives and so forth. And so there were times though where people had to live together to survive. And not only that, but it was also what's called a kinship network, a network in which the family really built off the traits, the experiences, the skills and knowledge of each other to help each other survive. And so that augmented family, you know, meant that maybe Uncle Jim came to live with us because he was able to help do some labor that someone else couldn't do, or he could contribute to the household so that, you know, we could all survive. And you still see some augmented families and extended families to this very day. I mean, those things have not changed that much. And then, of course, he came up with this concept called non-family. You probably wonder, what is non-family? Well, the non-family is really a group of people that live together, and they form a family network or a kinship network, and they do it for the purpose of supporting the household, supporting each other, and creating somewhat of a family structure to help them thrive and survive. And so you still see some patterns of this today. I mean, where friends who are not related to each other may share a household, and there's a purpose for them sharing that household. You know, they, first of all, it could be a financial reason, where it's cheaper to live with friends and create, you know, a network that will help you thrive and survive. It could also be another form of social networking, you know, where they're there to support each other, and there could be reasons for that. They could be foster children, they could be single parents, they could be, they're non-family, but they live together to support each other. But again, Billingsley came up with these three different concepts of family to really refute what Moynihan was talking about. Because Moynihan was talking about this whole notion of family being a pathological, like a bad thing because of the fact that there wasn't a mother and a father in the household, and that single parent households couldn't thrive. And so, and as I mentioned earlier, the Black family has been one of the most neglected and controversial areas of Black life when you think about it. There's like an abundance of myths, there's distortions, there's stereotypes that surround it. And most of the sociological research conducted in this area has viewed the Black family as a pathological entity, as Moynihan did, pretty much emphasizing its weaknesses instead of its strengths. And we do know, there were many strengths with the family. I'm gonna pause for a moment and ask if you have any questions on that first part, because I want to move into talking to you a little bit about theories, how do you explain the persistence of African American family structures? What are some of the theories behind the way families are created?
Go ahead, Pedro.
Oh, I was just curious about what you meant by I forgot the word. I'm a little out of it today. Sorry about that.
That's okay.
Scholarship.
Scholarship? So what I mean by scholarship is like all the research that goes on, the research, the books that are written, the studies that are done, and how all of that forms what they call a body of literature.
Okay.
And so you have all this literature, whether there's books, documentaries or whatever it may be, that focus in on this particular topic.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, no. So, so I'm going to try to move us from, like I said, the brief history. There's a lot of great books you can read on African American families, either prior to emancipation and even after. And then, of course, looking at the research or the scholarship. Moynihan, I point out because Moynihan's report was supported also by a number of sociologists who contributed to that report. It wasn't just his work, because he was just in a position, because he was the Secretary of Labor and a former senator, he was just in a position to promote it and to put it out there. And this kind of led to all kinds of policies. The probably heard the war on poverty that President Lyndon Johnson started back in the late 60s. And if poverty was the so-called issue, then people began to address poverty as one of the nuxes for Black families and the so-called pathology of the Black family. So, another question?
Yeah. Okay. With the Moynihan report, as you just said, his conclusion was that if jobs, and you talked about, they implemented social programs as opposed to creating jobs for these families to kind of get on their feet. Right? Was that his conclusion?
Well, it led to that. It didn't lead to job creation, as you just mentioned. It really led to social programs. So then we begin to see what was called the welfare industry. Welfare, in terms of reliance on government assistance. We begin to see an influx of that took place. And so, and as opposed to job creation, as opposed to training people and breaking down some of the barriers, like whether they were skilled trades, whether they were educational barriers, it didn't lead to that as much as it did to creating social programs.
So do you? So that kind of the social programs kind of contribute to the breakup of, like you said, the lower income families. Wouldn't you say that?
You're getting right to it. Yeah, you are. In fact, I'm going to share some theories with you, and just to kind of give you some ideas of, how the family was, how people view the family. These are some theories surrounding the Black family. Okay, so the one that's really most prevalent is the economic theory. Both social, I mean, it could be a social economic or an economic, but this explains some of the persistence of the so-called African-American family structure. And there were researchers that theorized that the low economic statuses of the newly freed slaves back in the 1850s, for example, led to the current family structure for African Americans. And so these researchers suggested that extreme poverty has increased the destabilization of African American families, while others point to a high female labor participation. Few job opportunities for Black males and small differences between wages for men and women that have decreased marriage stability for Black families. Okay, so in other words, women were able to move into the labor force at a much rapid pace than men. And so, again, some people would consider that one of the theories behind the destruction of the family. There's another economic theory that kind of goes back to the 1950s and 1960s, where they that the so-called creation of the man in the house rule. I don't know, this is something that happened back in the 50s and 60s. This restricted two-parent household from receiving government benefits, which made many Black fathers move out to be able to receive help to support their families, okay? In other words, if there was a man in the house, the ideal was that that man should be out there working. And if not, they weren't eligible for these benefits. So there was this movement of men out of some of the houses with their families so that their families could get these social benefits that we talked about. These rules were later abolished when the Supreme Court said this, someone took this to court and the Supreme Court abolished it and ruled against these exclusions. There was a case, I believe it was King versus Smith back in the day, where the court said you can't do that. You can't force men out of their household so that solely so that they could take advantage of government benefits. So that's kind of like a snapshot of the economic theory. The traditional African influence theory kind of works in a way in which it incorporates social mechanisms for the specific patterns of the African-American family. So in other words, some researchers were pointing to the differences in the norms regarding the need to live with a spouse or with children for African-Americans. And these patterns seen in traditional African cultures are also considered a source for the current trend in single-parent homes. So there was a social scientist by the name of Antonio McDaniel, and he talked about the reliance of African-American families on kinship networks. So the reliance on kinship networks means that, you can rely on this network for financial, emotional, or social support. And this is something that really dates back and can be traced back to many African cultures, where the emphasis was on extended families rather than on the nuclear family. So that, again, as I mentioned earlier, with Billingsley, he talked about extended families too. So some researchers then, they hypothesized that these African traditions were modified by experiences during slavery. So in other words, they brought their traditions over or with them when they came, or when they were captured and brought to the New World. And their traditions resulted in a current, in a form of African-American family structure that relies more on extended kinship versus relying on the nuclear family, okay? So and even McDaniels even noted that slavery caused a unique situation for African-American slaves, for African slaves, and that it alienated them from both true African and white culture so that slaves could not identify completely with either culture. They really struggled with that. So as a result, slaves were culturally adaptive and formed family structures that best really suit their environmental situation. Okay, so when you think about it, being enslaved, forming those kinships for economic, social purposes, that was a survival mechanism back in the day. So when we looked at the post-war expansion of the welfare state, and this is, again, Mr. Jones, you pointed this out, and there's a lot of economists that study this. You can look at the Great Society and social programs in the United States that evolved in the 60s and 70s. There were some economists, there are actually two Black economists, Walter Williams and Tom Sowell. They still kind of profess these things. They argue that the significant expansion of federal welfare under the Great Society programs that started in the 1960s contribute to the destruction of the African American family. Okay, and they really supported their arguments with a lot of strong research. And in fact, Sowell, he mentioned that the Black family, which had survived centuries of slavery and discrimination, began rapidly disintegrating in the liberal welfare state that subsidized things like unwanted pregnancy and changed welfare from an emergency rescue to a way of life, okay? Because welfare used to be a bailout that holds you over until you can get to the next, job or whatever it may be. But welfare then became, in some sense, permanent for some people. And in fact, they would even argue that there were a lot of factors that accelerated the decline of the Black family because of the welfare state, such as the advancement of technology lessening the need for manual labor to more technical know-how labor, and the women's rights movement. The women's rights movement came along and in general opened up employment positions, increasing competition, especially for white women in many non-traditional areas, which skilled Blacks may have continued to maintain their family structure in the midst of the rise in cost of living. And so these post-1960 expansion of the US welfare state was blamed for the destruction of the Black family. And even to this very day, there's still generations of families that have relied on public assistance and have perpetuated it, over the years. And in fact, some say children see that and they kind of model it and they figured, maybe that's the way to go. And there's some families that have broken the cycle, but there's some cycles that continue to continue. So another theory that kind of pops up too is the decline in Black marriages. So when you look at marriage in the United States today, the rate of African American marriage is consistently lower. It's always been consistently lower than white Americans. And in fact, it's pretty much declining. It's really declining. These trends are so pervasive that families who are married are considered a minority family structure. Particularly for Black families, it's a minority family structure. So for example, in 1970, 64% of adult African Americans were married. In 1970, 64% were married. By 2004, it was cut to 32%. Okay, it was 32%.
2004?
By 2004. And then in 2004, even 45% of African Americans had never even been married, compared to 25% of white Americans. Okay, and this number has gone up. I mean, now we're really hovering towards the teens when you look at these marriage rates, particularly those who've never been married.
Mm-hmm.
But the interesting thing about these marriage rates is that the research has shown that although the rates have dropped for African Americans, the birth rate has not. Okay, so the birth rate has not. The number of single parent homes has risen dramatically for Black women. One reason they cite for the low rates of African American marriage is a high age of first marriage for many African Americans. For African American women, the marriage rate increases with age compared to white Americans who follow the same trends but marry at a younger age than African Americans. Okay. So for example, one study found that the average age of marriage for Black women with a high school degree was 21.8 years compared to 20.8 years for white women. So 1 full year. Fewer labor force opportunities and a decline in real earnings for Black males since 1960s are also recognized as a source of increasing marital instability. And some researchers, they would argue that these two trends have led to a pool of fewer desirable males and male partners, and thus resulted in more divorces. So one type of marriage that has declined, that has, if you don't know about this, or maybe you heard about it, they were called shotgun marriages. So I don't know if you remember shotgun marriages, or those of you who are old enough to know this. Shotgun marriages is usually a marriage arranged because someone, the female, got pregnant by a male, and the parents would require them to get married. I mean, this was an early practice in the 50s. This drop in rate is documented by a number of out of wedlock, as they call it, births that now commonly occur. So between 1965 and 1989, for example, 3/4 of white out of wedlock births and 3/5 of Black out of wedlock births could be explained by situations where the parents would have married in the past. Okay. So 3/4, I'm almost talking about 75% of white, and then we're talking about 3/5, 3/5, almost, a third of Black marriages would have been shotgun marriages. And so that would have increased, the number of married families as opposed to single parents.
Mm-hmm.
And they argue that this is because prior to the 1970s, the norm was such that should a couple have a pregnancy out of wedlock, marriage was inevitable. There were cultural norms back then that kind of pushed people in that direction. And cultural norms have changed since then, giving women and men more agency to decide whether or not they want to get married and when they want to get married. And we see that happening today. There's people who live in families that the parents are not married, but they may have children, and they decide when they want to get married, or not get married. So this decline of marriage is another one of those theories that surround the demise of the Black family. And let me get to the last two. The rise in divorce rates. We know divorce in the United States is like a 50-50 kind of thing right now. And for African Americans who do marry, the rate of divorce is higher than white Americans. So we know that at least half of marriages for both Black and white marriages tend to end in divorce. And the rate of divorce tends to be consistently higher for African Americans. And so African Americans also tend to spend less time married than white Americans. Okay, spend less time married. And then overall, African Americans are married at a later age and spend less time married and are more likely to be divorced than white Americans. So when you look at the rise in divorce rates, there's a whole social dynamic that occurs within Black community itself in terms of the whole notion of marriage. And when we look at the decline in low success rates of Black marriages, it's crucial for studies because many African Americans achieve middle class status through marriage, right? They, by having 2 incomes or whatever it may be, and the likelihood of children growing up in poverty is triple for those in single parent rather than 2-parent homes. That's been well researched and documented. So some researchers suggest that the reason for the rise in divorce rates is the increase in acceptability of divorces. So people, divorce is something that people use to get out of a marriage, where in the past it was shunned upon to do that. Now it's not. And the decline in social stigma of divorce has led to a decrease in the number of legal barriers of getting a divorce, thus making the divorce easier for couples. Okay, it used to cost a lot of money to get a divorce at one time. Now people can divorce themselves. So they can file, they can use a paralegal. And so this whole tool of divorce has been used to also contribute to what they would say the demise of the Black family. And then the last one I want to point out, because this has been getting a lot of attention. I don't know if you've read are familiar with a book by Michelle Alexander that speaks to Black males in the prison complex. But Black male incarceration and mortality is definitely something that contribute highly to the black family demise. And a lot of this has to do with racial inequality in the American criminal justice system. You know, when you think about Black males and mortality. I mean, there's structural barriers. They often list the reason for the current trends in the African American family structure, specifically the decline of marriages. We could talk about imbalanced sex ratios. They have been cited as one of these barriers since the late 19th century, where census data show that, you know, there were more males per females. Let me back up. There were less males per females in the population. So for example, in 1984, there were 99 Black males for every 100 females within the population. Now the census, when it moved up to 2000, it was 91 Black males for every 100 females. Now we know that it's less than 90 Black males for every 100 females. We also know that, you know, Black male incarceration and higher mortality rates are often pointed to these imbalanced sex ratios. You know, although Black males make up 6% of the population, they make up 50% of those who are incarcerated. We know that in our federal and our state prisons. This incarceration rate for Black males increased by a rate of more than 4 between the years 1980 and 2003. And this is what Michelle Alexander points out in her book. As you know, we had the war on drugs. So you remember that. We had 3 Strikes You're Out. If you recall that. There were all kinds of policy, law and order. I think it started with Nixon with law and order, and moved in with Bill Clinton with the 3 Strikes You're Out. And so things kind of evolved where the incarceration rate for Black males increased during that 1980 to 2003 period dramatically. And the incarceration rate for African American males is maybe 3,045 out of 100,000 compared to 465 per 100,000 for white males. So for every 100,000 Black males, 3,000 plus are incarcerated compared to 465 per 100,000 for white males. I mean, so you could see this really huge imbalance. The chance that Black males will be arrested and jailed, we got to talk about that as well. Yeah, at least once in their lifetime. In many areas around the country, extremely high. We see that, you know, we see what's going on right now. And for Washington, D.C., and I lived in Washington, D.C., the probability is between 80 and 90%. I mean, I lived in Washington, D.C., and a short story, you know, I was held over so that someone can ID me because they thought that I was the person that robbed the liquor store. And the reason that they thought I was the person because I was riding a 10-speed bike in the neighborhood, and the perpetrator was seen getting away on a 10-speed. So I got pulled over. You know, luckily I was watching a basketball game in one of the parks, and I was leaning against the fence on my bike while they were playing, and these cops get out the car and they want to know where I've been. And I said, I've been here watching this game. And of course the brothers knew I was there because I've been sitting on the fence watching them play. And the cops wanted me to go along with them to this liquor store around the corner because apparently I had just got held up. And of course, you know, I'm thinking, I didn't do anything wrong. I don't know what's going on here. Who's gonna watch my bike? You know, was the other thing I was thinking about too. But the brothers said they would watch my bike. And so I get in the cop car, and the only thing that's crossing my mind is, what if this proprietor owner is angry and he just wants to implicate anybody because he's just ticked off, you know? That could be the end of my life. Or here I am entered into the criminal justice system, you know. Fortunately, the man, you know, they made me stand in front of the doorway and they pointed at me. The man said, no, that's not him. And so they put me back in the car. And, you know, I got a ride in the front seat this time and went back to the park and got my bike. But it was just a moment, you know, that could have made a difference between me entering the criminal justice system. That's why Washington, D.C. rates were so high. I mean, 80 to 90% in terms of being arrested in jail, because things like that, you know, things like that happen. And we know because Black males are incarcerated at 6 times the rate of white males, the skewed incarceration rates harm these Black males as well as their families and communities. I mean, 6 times the rate. And incarceration can affect former inmates and their futures in terms of when they leave prison, they have to leave prison. Those that have been incarcerated lose their masculinity sometimes, as incarceration can affect a man's confirmation of his identity as a father even. So after being released from prison, efforts to reestablish or sustain some connection and be active within the family are often unsuccessful when you think about it, when men leave prison. Because incarceration can be damaging to familial ties and can have a negative effect on family relations and a man's sense of masculinity. We know in 34 states, those who are on parole or probation are not allowed to vote. I think Florida just changed that recently. And in 12 states, a felony conviction means never voting again. So a criminal record affects one's ability to secure federal benefits or get a job. You know, one study even found that Blacks with a criminal record were the least likely to be called back for a job interview in comparison to Blacks and white applicants who weren't incarcerated. As you know, California is not like kind of leading the country in terms of removing that question off of applications because they understand the effect and the implications that this has on Black men and men in general as it relates to generating income and supporting families. We also know that incarceration has been associated with higher rates of disease, increased likelihood of smoking cigarettes, for example, and premature death. And so all these kind of things, you know, when you think about it, you know, impacts the social structure, which then impacts the family structures. And studies show that paternal incarceration may contribute to children's behavioral problems and lower performance in school. So in other words, when children know their father is in prison, it can affect their academic performance in school, and also it could lead to behavioral problems. Also, the female partner of male inmates are more likely to suffer from depression and struggle economically, when you think about it as well. And so these effects contribute to the barriers impacting the African American family structure. You know, I don't really have to talk about mortality because the mortality rates for African males are also typically higher than they are for African American females. And we know that, you know, there's more males that die in a given year than females. So between this high incarceration rate and mortality rates, this kind of helps explain the low marriage rates for many African American females who cannot find Black partners. All right. So let's see where I'm at on these slides. So I'm going to stop right there. I mean, I threw out 3 or 6 theories that were known to impact family structure. And I would like to kind of get a sense of your thoughts on these theories and whether or not you feel one of them tend to have more impact on the families than another. Any thoughts?
When you mentioned economic theory, first thing came to mind was the movie Claudine. And I remember it being one of the first walk-in movies my family and I went to together. It was my mother, father, three brothers, actually four brothers, because my youngest brother was a baby in arms. So, yeah, it reminded me of that movie. And even at 5 is the age I was when this happened, when we saw this, of how deep an impact it had on me, even at age 5. Like I could understand that it was wrong, at least, even if I didn't understand the complexity of how the Black family was forced to be, and how unfortunate it was for that to be placed upon us. Forced.
Okay, well, thank you for sharing that. Like, I remember that movie too. It was quite impressionable when you think about it.
Yeah.
Any other thoughts in terms of these theories?
Yeah, I was looking at all of them. They, for me, anyways, because these are things that I look at and I've looked at for many years. But they all kind of play a factor in the way all those things kind of go together. If not in one spot or another, but they're kind of like intertwined, I would say. I forgot where I read, this was several years ago, but it was like a manifesto on how to disrupt the family in Black slavery with removing the male from the family, which is still kind of the message today with incarceration of Black males and removing them from the household. But yeah, they just all kind of fit together. You know, the economics, being able to provide, but not being able to get a job, or needing to provide, not being able to get a job. The expansion of welfare, which we know that was available to everybody that needed it, yet the ones that really benefited were white Americans during the 50s and 60s. They were able to go ahead and move ahead and get jobs and be able to get out of those situations and acquire wealth through buying properties. The decline in Black marriage and the rising divorce rates, of course. It's hard to kind of hold something together. You were talking about earlier how women it was easier for women to get into the workforce and basically create their own income, demasculating the man. I would say for me, situations like that are very difficult, trying to make a stable marriage work when as a man of color trying to get a job, but yet your partner's constantly being, making more than you, and in the situations, my personal situations I've seen, I got friends of mine, Latina women or Black female friends of mine who will get a job in an office somewhere, and mostly based on looks, mostly attractive women. They get these really good jobs, and they come around and it's like, well, this guy can't get a job. He can't do this. He can't do that. But not for lack of trying, more of lack of acceptance and being able to get those jobs in those positions. End up in a position where you're either working construction, long hours, and then you get to see the other side where the white counterpart male is got the good job, got the good money, got the wealth, got the ability to make those things possible. I think all those things kind of really play a role in how things work today, just the way they've been in the past and how they continue to grow. I look at it all and just really see how that plays a role.
Okay, thank you for those comments.
Can I make a comment about the post-U.S. expansion of the welfare state and the decline in marriage? You mentioned that the white women's liberation movement, and some Black women got caught up in that. And I think, for whatever reason, what I'm talking about, the realities of what the Black male experience. It's always for lower income people. We didn't get a chance to get all the education and stuff. And with the women's rights movement and post welfare state America, a lot of our women became got a chance to get educated, and like you mentioned, they got jobs and stuff like that. And just like the previous gentleman said, it was easier for our women to get work than us, and that probably took a lot of psychological toll on a man's perspective about, you know, like, I'm the head of the house, and then, you know, sometimes women think that if they making the money and stuff like that, then you not you know, talking about, I'm the head of the house, and you know, because it's based on money, and that could probably contribute to the like decline of black marriage and stuff like that. We got a problem with leadership in the family here. You know what I'm talking about? And if a man don't have a way to take care of himself or the family, then he kind of loses some of his perceived power. You know, the power he perceives in himself, and then the power that the woman might perceive in him. You know, it's basic. All of this is kind of based on racism and stuff. And now some of these problems won't be settled until we get, until we get that racism problem eliminated. In my opinion, that's my comment.
Okay. Well, thank you for sharing those comments. I mean, you know, you both kind of hit it on the head. I mean, these 6 things could be intertwined. I mean, they actually could be related to one another. Whereas, you know, some people could focus in on one thing and say, this is, and this is where these theories come from, because people actually studied these items and said, this is what's causing the deterioration of the Black family. And so one thing that I failed to note, number 3, the post-US expansion of the welfare state, in many studies that you look at, contributed, they all pretty much point to how that contributed to the erosion of the Black family. As I mentioned, you know, with the man in the house thing, I mean, that was a rule that kicked in that drove men out the household, even to the point where we were moving up into the 1960s, where there were still 2-family stable households. And then shortly after that, you know, these social programs and these expansion on addressing issues of poverty, what I call social experiments, kicked in, and it began to erode and impact families in a very bad way. And then later on, you know, when you look at Black male incarceration and mortality, I mean, you have to be real about this. I mean, that's a long period of time in which Black males, and particularly, you know, males of color, were under assault by law and order, you know, for whatever reason you want to point to. Even to this very day, I mean, we're still seeing it. It really hasn't changed. And I think due to the expansion of social media and being able to video, I'm sure back then we could have videoed and showed a lot of social media things if that technology was available, because now it's so available. We begin to see the results of all of this, and this notion of racism, you know, this white supremacy, the white superiority. I mean, that whole thinking is starting to be challenged, you know, to the extent that, you know, we really have to go back and look at these structures, and racism being one of them, both from an institutional and an individual standpoint. So
I got one other thing. The civil rights movement. There was gains, and there were, in my opinion, gains and losses. Okay, I believe in you know, in the Black. We're talking about the Black family, extended families, and stuff like that. And we did have some small businesses that were in place because of segregation and stuff. And I don't know, we lost that, a lot of that. It opened the door for a lot of people like to affirmative action, so a lot of people got educated and were able to make the type of monies to move out of neighborhoods and stuff. But for the most part, I think it kind of, there were a lot of losses from all of that. You know, it was some positive stuff, but then we still dealing with like people being brutalized by police and stuff like that. We still got problems, you know. So how much did we gain? How much did we gain?
It's a very good question. You know, some would, I mean, even if you look at the research, some would argue that affirmative action really benefited white women the most, as opposed to, you know, the people that it was intended to benefit. And that's very clear and evident when you look at, you know, who's involved in, you know, leadership, corporate roles, you name it. You see more white women than you do Black women or Latino women or men or whatever. And the research will bear that out, that they were the true beneficiaries of affirmative action.
Pedro had a question.
Go ahead.
It was more just a comment on what Jen said earlier about perceived power, perceived masculinity, and it's just it's the perception. That was one thing I just wanted to highlight, was just how we perceive ourselves, I guess, as men in a relationship, especially during the 1960s. You know, moving forward, I believe now, especially with the feminine movement and women doing better. Of course, you know, we always want anybody that can to do better, but there was that thing. They really just kind of struck me. I just wanted to just add on to that a little bit.
Okay, thank you there. Any other comments before I move on to sort of the second half? Okay, so I really wanted to get everybody thinking about, you know, not only that history, but also some of the things that impacted the African-American or Black family. You know, those theories that we just went through, the kind of discussion that we just had, the thoughts that you all just shared. Because in the end, you know, we pretty much rejected Moynihan, you know, and even though almost 70% of Black children are born to single mothers compared to white women, that's still pretty high. Those mothers, however, are more likely than married mothers to be poor, even after post-welfare reform, decline in child poverty. So in other words, the post-welfare reform did decrease child poverty, but it did not decrease what they would say single-parent families, okay? They are also likely to pass the poverty on to their children. And then there's a number of research studies that have revealed that many one-parent families are more intact or cohesive than many two-parent families. And I found this very interesting because you can look at data on child abuse, battered wives, runaway children. They indicate higher rates among two-parent families in suburban areas than one-parent families in inner city communities. That's pretty phenomenal when you think about it. So feminism pointed to the oppressive ideal of the nuclear family, image of male privilege, okay? And there has been an uptick in the number of Black children living with married parents. And so the family really has gone through what I would call an evolution, you know, and it kind of morphs based upon society and the structures that impact the family. So, you know, feminism came about, maybe women didn't get married or they get married at a later age. However, it did not, you know, it did not obliterate the family. Maybe families started to take on different forms. And that's pretty much how many social sciences look at it today, that families do take on different forms. I mean, as I mentioned earlier, the two-parent family, particularly two-parent white family, is a minority, you know, when you think about it. So we have to kind of look at these patterns and these structures as it evolves and as society evolves in terms of what's being impacted. And I'm just going to share some things with you very quickly in terms of how we're going to see the future. So we do know there's more Latinos, more Hispanics, less white people, because about half of all US population growth is occurring among Hispanics. And the median age for Hispanics or Latinos is just 26. So it's a younger population. And so we're seeing more growth, and that's going to be the future. We know there's smaller families. Okay, in 1915, the average household contained more than 4 people. Today, the average is 2.5. I don't know, that half must be a dog or a cat because they all get considered to be part of the family at some point. Large families are increasingly rare. You don't see large families anymore. And there's reasons for that. You know, one of the reasons is later marriage or no marriage. You know, people marrying later in life, which was an old custom that's being revived. And today, nearly half of Americans 25 to 29 are unmarried. And so, I mean, so when you think about smaller, later marriage, you know, fewer white people, more Hispanic, more people that are from other cultural backgrounds, the future is really changing. We begin to see that. And then lastly, we have more educated people. You know, the GI Bill enabled millions to go to college after World War II. And we've had wars after that, you know, the Persian Gulf War and the war of Afghanistan. And then more people who've joined the military are taking advantage of the upward trend to get education. And this is a trend that's emerging across all groups. So all groups. So when we look at the future, you know, and you think about the future in this realm here that I'm pointing out to you, I mean, what are you thinking about? You know, what do you see? You know, what do you see happening as it relates to the family? Any comments?
Well, just like for my own experiences with the more Hispanics, less whites, we're right next to Mexico. So it plays a huge role on the fact that California, Texas was part of Mexico. So basically the border crossed Latino people, not the other way around. But yeah, like, I don't know, like for me growing up in an impoverished area, I look at people and I had a lot of cousins of mine, aunts of mine that would be on welfare. And the idea was have more kids, get more welfare. Mm-hmm. You know, if the man was in the house, there was no welfare. And we had talked about that a little bit earlier about the men leaving the household because of those reasons, because women were allowed to get the welfare and not men. I look at these things and yeah, the education really helps. I'm one of those people using the GI Bill, so I know how that works. But the opportunity to use those things nowadays, the opportunity to think about even buying a house, but without education, it's very difficult. I went to a little story. I went to my grandmother's birthday party about 3 years ago when she turned 90. And I had a lot of my cousins and uncles and stuff, all Mexican, all from Mexico. And when I knew them when they were younger, they were all very hardworking, they're people that just work really, really hard. And they gave everything they could to their families and tried to acquire some kind of wealth, but without papers, it's very impossible to make anything happen. And I went to this party, my grandmother's party, and I looked at all my cousins and my uncles who were broken down, tired, no savings, no nothing like that. And the only thing they have to really pass on is their genetic code is having children. So you have that idea of growing the Latino population. So it's interesting. It's good knowledge.
Well, thanks for sharing that, Pedro. I appreciate your comments. Because you see this population growing in other places than California as well. I mean, if you go to Illinois, I mean, they're almost 20 to 30% in the city of Chicago. You go to, of course, New York, you know, you have Puerto Ricans and Dominicans. If you go to Florida, you have Cubans. But I mean, the population growth because of the median age, for example, and the households are definitely changing the complexion of this country, you know, as it relates to more Latino, more Hispanic people. The other thing that's happening too is, you know, who's having babies? You know, demographers would point to this particular chart. We're talking about women who are fertile between the ages of 15 and 44. And the numbers, as you can see, the replacement value is 2.1. And you can see these other groups, you know, they're not there. I mean, Black African Americans are just at the 2.1, but you could see the Latino Hispanic population replacing themselves. In fact, they would say they're quite exceeding the replacement value. And so this definitely has a lot of implications about the future in terms of what the future is going to look like, who is going to be the future, you know, and which is why it's so important for us to make sure that education occurs within these communities, because we're looking for the future and folks to take on these leadership roles, okay? And we're starting to see some of that in America. And I throw this out because I want you to see, you know, the change in demographics in the United States. So you could see in the 1990 census, you know, the population back then and in 2000. And here's a projection for 2030. You know, these small groups are going to be larger groups. And if you start stacking them up on top of each other, they're going to definitely be what they would call minority majority. California's already there. Okay, we've already reached that pinnacle of being a majority minority state, quote unquote. And so, and I'll show you California. So you can see California in 1990, 2010, we passed that already. And here's 2050. These are the projections. You know, this is where the population shifts are going to occur. We see significant population shifts even in Asian Pacific Islander numbers, okay? And you can see the white population declining. You know, there's a lot of political implications here and a lot can be said about that, which is why we're kind of facing some of these issues in our state, because people begin to see the growth of the state in terms of who is emerging as a population. And in my work, you know, I'm interested in healthcare, and I look at the physician population in California. You look at the active physicians and the population, they don't match up, okay? You can see Latinos, 5% of the physicians, but 30% of the 38% of the people. The same is true with African Americans, 3% of the physicians, but only 6% of the population. And so, you know, we talk about population parity, you know, if that's going to be the case. If not, then these other groups, you know, like the overrepresented groups. Take, for example, Asians are 14% of the state population, but they're nearly 30% of the healthcare providers. You know, whites, 39% of the population, they don't even have parity with their own right now. Okay, so we are beginning to see the need to try to increase these numbers because these numbers are going to be increasing. Okay, and even the Asian population to that extent. The same could be true for dentists. You know, I looked at dentistry, and you can see it's pretty much a male-dominated profession, but the female population is emerging. It's about 30% of professional active dentists are now females. But the numbers from underrepresented groups are small when you think about it. You know, they're primarily Caucasian oral health care practitioners, which is, again, the reason why the whole notion of training care providers to be culturally humble, culturally competent is so important, because we know these numbers are not going to change overnight. You know, it's going to be very hard to get those numbers up. So I'll talk a little bit about racial and ethnic healthcare disparities, because we're talking about differences in the quality of healthcare, and it's primarily due to these three things: the access-related factors or clinical needs, the patient preference regarding healthcare, and the appropriateness of intervention. So when we talk about access-related factors or clinical needs, is to think about where most people who have health challenges live and where are the care providers. In many cases, we have to leave our community, catch a bus, drive a car, or get transported to another part of the city, sometimes in another part of the state, in parts of our state, to get healthcare. So the access issue is really, really critical. You know, I was fortunate to be around long enough to watch one of my former students in high school who lived in Oakland. She was in a summer program I ran at UCSF, and she ended up going to Berkeley for undergrad. She was first-gen low-income student, and then she ended up going to UCLA for medical school. And she just emailed me the other day that she's going back to Oakland to practice in her own community because she got a residency there. And that's been her all-time goal, is to return back to my community. And then eventually she wants to create a clinic that's accessible to the people that live in that community in East Oakland. Okay, so when you think about it, access is a huge reason for these disparities. Patient preference, we all have this preference towards wanting to be served by people that look like us or that speak like us or that have a relationship to our community or culture. And so, you know, when you go get personal services, you know, you go get a haircut, black men like to go to a black barber, you know, vice versa. You want to get your hair done, you know, black women like to go to black women for beauticians and so forth. But if you can go to somebody that you can choose, and there's reasons for this, people feel comfortable, they have a cultural connection, or they might have a language connection. I mean, it's a preference that patients have regarding their healthcare. And of course, appropriateness of an intervention. We know if we look at studies in terms of who gets, you know, the higher level treatment. So you go into the emergency room, you're having chest pains, you might get an exam, you might get some medication and sent home. Someone else might go in that same emergency room, they get an exam, but they might get a stress test. They might get a echocardiogram to determine if there's any clogs going on in the arteries. That's the appropriateness that doesn't happen for some communities that happen for others. And so those lead to these disparities that we talked about. And when we analyze these disparities, we're looking at how they operate. You know, one is the system itself, the healthcare system and the legal and regulatory climate in which these healthcare systems operate. We know it's broken. You know, the whole notion of quote unquote Obamacare that 45 wants to get rid of is one of the solutions to try to fix a broken healthcare system. We also know that there's discrimination at the individual and patient provider level. And I gave you an example, you know, with the treatment of someone that's having heart problems. That happens between the patient and provider all the time. It could also be based upon first impression, you know, just looking at you, trying to determine who you are, where you come from, you know, what kind of individual you are. And they do have an influence in terms of how healthcare gets dispersed. And so discrimination, you know, we talk about that in the sense that care that results from biases or prejudice or stereotyping and uncertainty in clinical communication and decision making. We know discrimination exists in healthcare. I don't know how many of you have gone to a healthcare provider. It may not happen with your primary care provider. It could happen with a specialist. It could even happen with the people at the front desk, you know, who's a medical assistant or the nurse. But we do know discrimination exists within healthcare and the administration of healthcare, which kind of, you know, when you think about it, has some adverse effect on the family, because you have healthy families that have healthy communities. So let's look at this. Staying healthy is easier for some than others. So when you look at this chart, you could see from education, you know, upper class people get college, lower class or lower working get GEDs or high school diplomas. Housing, you know, could be, they can own it, it's safe. You know, we have to rent, sometimes it's safe. Physical activities, they have gyms and parks. We have parks and phys ed sometimes, but sometimes that could be insecure depending on where those parks are. Advertising, sparse. You don't see a lot of ads in upper class neighborhoods, but when you go to working class or class neighborhoods where there's a lot of people in condensed areas, it's pervasive, you know, with billboards and all kinds of signs. Neighborhood stores, there's fruits and vegetables, food is secure. Ours tend to deal more with alcohol, food, being insecure. The police, we all know about that, right? They're helpful in upper neighborhoods, lower, they tend to be abusive. Healthcare, private docs versus the ER, and if you're a veteran, maybe the VA. Sick leave, some people acute or cured, some people don't get it at all. And then leisure priority, you know, is it exercise or rest? And then working conditions, we know about this, you know, some people work in very safe, they're in high decision areas, there's flex time, whereas working conditions for lower SES tends to be hazardous. There's no decision making. In other words, they don't have any control over deciding how to do their job. They have to do it as it's been told. Childcare, there's nanny or high quality daycare facilities versus a family member or neighbor taking care of children, or even a low quality daycare center. And then the elderly, you know, high quality facilities, it's nursing homes whereas our, you know, our elderly tend to be with our families or neighbors. Very few are in low quality facilities. Then, of course, the criminal justice system. Very little contact for upper SES and much contact for lower SES. So as you can see, staying healthy can be easier for some than others. And this is just like an everyday kind of occurrence, right? This is just not like spot on. You can take one of these and this happens, but this is the life, you know? This is where communities differ, very, very different, very, very different. Then we talk about the most common cancers by sex and ethnicity. You can see between the males, I have this chart, and females. These are pretty typical among males and females: prostate, lung, and colorectal, breast, lung, and colorectal. And the same is true for African Americans and for Hispanic Latinos. They tend to be common cancers. But when we get into Asian Indian or Chinese or Japanese, Korean, Laotian, the cancer is somewhat different. Asian Indians tend to be lymphoma because of their exposure to the sun. You know, their skin tends to generate lymphomas. Koreans tend to be stomach for both male and females. Men because of diet, you know, high acidic diets. And then Laotians the same. You know, they have high acidic diets, but they also have early childbirth rates. And so women tend to experience cervix. Men are out in the field or out doing labor. So you see lymphoma there, and then liver. And then the years of potential life loss by ethnicity. And we're talking about potential life that's lost because of diseases that are somewhat preventable. And as you can see, for African Americans, it tends to be cancer and heart disease. I mean, way, way up there. For, you can see the other groups, Asians, cancers tend to be prominent for all groups, except for Native Americans. These are unintentional injuries. And this unintentional injuries is related to Native Americans who live on reservations, which many of them do. And their injuries tend to be accidents. Okay, so it could be a farming accident, it could be an accident involving maybe an animal, or an accident that they've had on a fence or something of that nature, building a fence, or, you know, whatever that may be. But unintentional injuries tend to be high amongst that group than any other group. So given what I just shared with you, we talked a little bit about the disparities, and we talked about these rates of illnesses and diseases. What, again, comes to mind for you? What do you tend to be thinking about?
I was just curious about, we talked about, you know, having more doctors and nurses of Latin descent, of, you know, Black doctors and nurses. Do you feel that the urban population, the urban school districts, and the lack of education, and having just basic necessities for education that people in suburban areas, white Americans, have access to, as far as like just education in general? So by the time they get to a place of like higher education, not really being up to par with the education level in order to be successful in higher education.
So you're kind of speaking to maybe the educational pathway in terms of where?
Yeah, the educational pathway. Just like I said, I know for me, like I grew up in Union City, and just education where I was at, anyways, wasn't very good. I did go to James Logan for a while, and they transferred me to what do you call that? The secondary schools. But the education just wasn't up to par. The access to just other stuff, just access to the arts, access to books and things that you need. Do you think that plays a factor in higher education?
That, you know, you're right about that. I mean, in terms of access to a good education, if you want to say that, in terms of what resources are available in that particular community.
Correct.
That's going to support you in terms of your learning, your ability to thrive, you know, the potential that you may have in terms of the knowledge that you acquire, the resources and the networking that's available to you as well. They vary from community to community. And, you know, California, as probably know this, at one time had one of the best K-12 systems in the country. And after the vote of Proposition 13, in the 80s, where property taxes no longer supported local schools, the education system began to erode because they weren't getting the proper funding. Whereas some school districts still maintain those funding mechanisms and some didn't, through either volunteer networks or through living in areas in which people are more middle income and could provide supplemental instruction and things of that nature. And so a lot of inner city schools, some suburban schools, they started going downhill. So when we talk about things like schools that have certified teachers to teach the subject that they're trained to teach, because sometimes you can have a history teacher teaching math, you can talk about access to labs, and if you're doing science, do they have the best equipment? Is the lab up to date? You can also talk about the arts and music, in terms of getting cultural enrichment. And so some of those things went away because there were just no funding for them. And so the state kicked in later. Of course, we had the lottery, which really doesn't go a long way in terms of supporting higher education. And in the good years, the state can help, and in bad years, education suffers. The last thing I think California did was through a proposition measure, which did fund schools through a tax levy, but I think it's time limited. So that tax levy can run out, and then next thing you know, they're going to need another vote to renew it, or they're going to let it die and try to find another way to support higher education. But higher education and access to better education definitely is related to the community and the school district that one is a part of.
Okay, I'd like to make a statement about the family, okay, and men being in the household. I take examples like Michael Jordan, the Venus and Serena Williams, Tiger Woods, people like that. Their fathers were in their lives, and I think the outcome was better. Achievement was better with them being in the family for some reason. I can't explain the chemistry or whatever, but it seems to work better. And I think that, some of the social ills that we have to deal with in our community and stuff like that, we have to get back to some of that stuff before, to get better outcomes. That's just my opinion. What do you think about that?
Well, I think, given where we are in this country and what's considered the so-called norm, that those two-parent families and families that have a mother and father tend to thrive better because of the way the structure is set up. Not to say that single-parent families, people don't thrive. I don't know if you remember that first single-parent television show, Julia. You remember she was a nurse, and she had this one boy she was raising. So it's not that single parent families can't thrive, but I think a lot of that will lend itself to single families that don't live in poverty. Okay. And given that, Black Americans tend to have higher poverty rates, I think we're like 23% of Black Americans live in poverty. Given that poverty kind of drives opportunity, then that has a lot to do with it as well. That influences it. Because there's been a lot of single parents that have had really good jobs, great jobs, that have raised children that have gone on and done great things. But that because they had the income and the means to do that and to be supportive and to create a structure and a network to help those children thrive. But there's a lot of parents, if I talk about that 23% of the, what are we, almost 40 million people? 23% of 40 million people is a lot of people, that are not being able to benefit because of the social conditions that they may be in. Some of those students, I would have to say some of those children break that cycle, and sometimes it's broken through the cycle because of other programs or influences that come in their lives that allow them to break that cycle. So maybe you go to high school with someone who's middle income and they're involved in athletics, for example, and you get involved in athletics. And we've seen that happen, you know, for kids who get involved in athletics that thrive and do well. They go on, right? They get their education. They break the cycle, and other children in the family follow them. I mean, I have to attest, I broke the cycle for my family. You know, when I went to college, I was the first, and now I got all kinds of cousins and people trying to break my cycle. You know, they want to be, and I applaud them because I want them to be better than me. But again, it's the poverty affiliated and associated with the family structure that leads to these what we call, you know, dysfunctional pathological characteristics of the Black family.
Thank you.
So I'm going to wrap up with one other thing, and then, you know, if you have questions at the end, you can feel free to do so. I mentioned, we talked about, you know, the brief history. We talked a little bit about the theories, and then we kind of delved into some of the disparities that occur in health, which you saw those rates in terms of diseases and illnesses and things of that nature. But when we talk about Black families and COVID-19, because this is where we are now, you know, we're talking about almost a third of Black families know someone who died of COVID-19. I mean, a third, that's quite a few people. 30% of the COVID-19 patients are Black, and Blacks only represent 13% of the US. So that's something to be concerned about. And we do know that underlying health disparities and social determinants contribute to contracting COVID-19, such as racism, medical settings, and the physical effects of discrimination. There's less access to testing and medical care. We talked about access. Remember, I talked about that being one of the disparity factors. And then redlining, environmental contagions, which create conditions that impact health and well-being. Simply because of redlining, people were forced to live in areas that might not have been the best areas to live in. And so, I mean, some of us are living around in South LA, for example, around oil fields they're still active, you know, in Ladera Heights. And, you know, some of us live in parts of LA in which there are industrial complexes that are churning out pollutants. If you ever been to Long Beach and you live near the pier, trucks are spewing diesel particles every day. And so these environmental cages can create these conditions that impact our health, which then become the underlying condition that COVID-19 tends to prey on. And then, as I mentioned earlier, 22% of Black families live in poverty compared to just 9% of white families. And so, again, this whole notion of poverty and discrimination out throughout has a huge impact on COVID-19, and particularly Black families. So, you know, I was looking at the disproportionate toll on people of color in New York City, for example. And if you notice, you know, these are people that are not hospitalized that had positive readings. These people were hospitalized, but it wasn't fatal. And these have been known to die. And so in all three categories, Black, African Americans, Hispanic, Latino tend to be far more ahead of these other groups. And some would attest it's related to these unknown or underlying health conditions that we all experience. You know, whether it's high blood pressure, whether it's diabetes, whether it's heart conditions of any sort. It could be sickle cell anemia even. Those underlying conditions can be a huge factor into whether or not you're going to be hospitalized or not hospitalized, or maybe ultimately leading to death. So anyways, I want to conclude by talking about genealogy, because family is a part of us knowing who our history is, you know, tracing our lineage. And genealogists, they use these oral histories and interviews and records to obtain information about family and how to demonstrate kinship and pedigree for its different members and so on. And as we all know, everybody that came here, minus the American Indians or Native Americans, are foreign to this land. You know, some were bought under, you know, in bondage, and some were some were forced to flee because of religious persecution or whatever. And of course, some, like Pedro mentioned, I mean, overnight, California became, Mexico, part of Mexico became California. And so some of us were acquired, by the United States. But either way, we all came from somewhere, and we all have a history and a beginning somewhere. And so I always, in my family class when I taught it, I always try to get students to kind of try to do a genealogy, find out, where you came from, who was in your family. Here is an example, just a small example of a mother and father and their two children, okay? And this father definitely has two siblings, and this mother obviously doesn't have any, but they all came from grandparents too. And I'm sure if you kind of work this out, these grandparents had family members as well. And these grandparents had mothers and fathers as well. And the thing that I always try to challenge my students to do is, how far back can you go in understanding who you are and what your family is all about? Because you continue this legacy of your family by knowing who you are and by creating such a genealogy chart for yourselves. And so, when you think about it, we have rich histories in our families. Little do we know. We may not know that, but I bet you if you do some genealogy search on your family, you're going to find and learn something about someone in your family that was very instrumental in either the contributions made to your family or even to this country, or for that matter. I've done this genealogy myself, and I have an aunt. That's all she does, is she goes back and she looks at everybody's genealogy. She's traced our family back to 1700 Virginia. I mean, that's how big she was able to do that. And that's on my dad's side. On my mom's side, I can trace back to her great-grandparents, because there's some parents, there was a period of time where people didn't like to talk about their family. There's some history, some bad history that occurred that keeps them from talking and don't want to go back that far. But we do know on my mom's side, her father, believe it or not, was one of the descendants of Pap Singleton, who was I call him a revolutionary back in slave. He led slave uprisings in South Carolina, him and Nat Turner. Of course, both of them met their demise, but that's her family, And when you understand things like that about your family, maybe you'll begin to understand things about you. Why am I so out there and defiant, or such a person that questions everything? Well, it goes back to your family. There were people in your family that were like that, and those traits get passed on. So again, I challenge you all to think about exploring your genealogy, to find out something about your father and your mother's people. And if their grandparents are still alive, find out about their people too. I'm sure you'll be surprised how people are willing to talk about their family, especially as they get older, because they want to pass some of that knowledge down. And they want you to know, in terms of the legacy of of your family. So I'm at the end. I think we're kind of narrowing up on that 2-hour mark. I didn't think I'd go that long, Professor. I thought maybe I'd get done earlier, but I appreciate the comments and the questions that people contributed to this discussion today.
The genealogy piece is so incredibly important.
Yes.
So incredibly important to being able to understand your own health, as as what was illustrated in your previous slide. As well, if you can find out anything about how they ate, is also very important to helping you live better.
Exactly. Well, in this case, I use this because this family was tracing heart disease on grandpa's side,
Mm-hmm.
and diabetes on grandma's side. So family history, when doctors always ask you, does anybody in your family ever had a history of whatever? Some of these things are passed on. You know, these are passed on. And so sometimes maybe mom or dad might not get that gene, but maybe you don't have it, but your sister may have it. Okay, so it's very important to know. Any other questions or comments before we zoom out, I guess?
I have one comment. Did you see, and I'll be right with you, Pedro. Did you see this morning that there was a report about the number of doses or vials that are now available, or that Trump will make available for speeding the recovery time for those who have been affected by COVID, or those?
Oh yeah, that I guess it's called Remdesivir, that drug.
Right.
Yes, yeah.
But it also brings to mind, and Dr. Fauci actually alluded to this, what factors are they going to use to determine who gets those, who gets that drug, and
Right. Well, that's that access issue again. You know, we could speak to that. Certainly, there's going to be some discrimination, possibly. You know, some
maybe social determinants.
some social determinants, exactly.
Go ahead, Pedro.
I was just going to say it was very informative, and just it triggered a lot of questions. And even I know that some questions I don't even have yet that'll probably come up later on in the future. But yeah, I just want to say thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate your comments too.
This is recorded, and many students will see it afterwards who just aren't available to be present right now. They might be at work or what have you, but students do log on and watch these videos afterwards. So it's not only important for those that are present here today to have seen you and talked to you, but it'll also be very helpful to the other students that'll view it afterwards.
Well, great. Well, again, thank you again for giving me the opportunity to share with your class today.
Thank you so much for gracing us with your information. Extremely important information.
Great.
Anyone else?
Thank you, brother, for your time and breaking out some good knowledge and stuff like that. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. I appreciate your comments too. I mean, you know, we're all kind of here to learn, and sometimes you ask questions that I have to go back and try to research myself sometimes, because more questions lead to more answers, and we all need to know the answers to some of these complex situations that are occurring today. So thank you all.
Thank you so much. All right, we'll be in touch, Dr. Alexander.
Okay, bye-bye now.
Bye-bye. See all of you all on Wednesday.